everyone who's Sri Lankan on Staten Island, we know of each other, right?
Or then they come and greet you. Then they come and invite you to have tea or coffee.
It's good to live around with a lot of people that from the same country. On the weekend, get together, play some cricket.
We're recovering from a war that ended 10 years ago.
Because of the recent attacks, that idea of like what we overcame in those 10 years has kind of diminished, but we can do it again.
Staten Island is home to around 5,000 people of Sri Lankan descent. It's the largest concentration in the New York City area, and one of the largest outside Sri Lanka. Thousands of miles from the island nation, this community is coming together to heal in the wake of decades of violence, including a 30-year civil war. First, let's look at how Sri Lankans came to Staten Island. Little Sri Lanka is the center. It's a stretch of restaurants and shops along Victory Boulevard and Bay Street in the Tompkinsville section. It's a neighborhood that's long attracted immigrants, historically Irish, German, and Jewish.
By the turn of the century, there were buses, there were trolleys going up and down what is now Victory Boulevard. A lot of people chose that area, though, because they could get transportation to the Staten Island ferry. They go to Manhattan, they earn their living.
The longest suspension bridge in the world, about to take its place as a new world wonder.
Transportation continued its influence. It's thought the first Sri Lankans came to Staten Island, in any great number at least, in the 1970s, shortly after the construction of the Verrazano Bridge paved the way for many Staten Island families to move further into the borough.
It is an auspicious debut for the bejeweled beauty.
The focus, when the bridge opened on November 21st, 1964, moved to central Staten Island, where all the farmland was, because developers, in anticipation of the bridge's opening, bought acres and acres of land to build two-family houses.
Rent prices went down in Tompkinsville, and that, along with the neighborhood's proximity to Manhattan, drew more newcomers.
The North Shore, the East Shore always attract the new immigrant groups.
Among them, Mexicans, Albanians, and of course, Sri Lankans.
This especially on my mutton curry from my mother-in-law.
So you got along with your mother-in-law?
Yes, yeah. Oh yeah, I have along with my mother-in-law. She's good, she's good.
V.G. Devidas started her restaurant New Asha on Victory Boulevard nearly 20 years ago.
That time, no restaurants around here. We are the only one. So many places came after us. People come, they shop, they come and eat, and they go. So the summertime, they are playing a Sri Lankan music and walk around. It's so like a mini Sri Lanka.
It's like safe, and they feel like family's also nearby, so that's how the community kind of built up.
Yeah, one person comes and then
another person, and it keeps coming. Because it's like, because we believe obviously New York has great opportunities and jobs.
Nowhere is Sri Lankan's culture more on display than at a nearby museum on Bay Street. Julia Vijayasinghe started the Sri Lankan Art and Cultural Museum of New York 2 years ago. She was just 18 years old. She first ran the museum out of the basement of her family's restaurant before expanding to a larger space down the street.
For me, this was like a dream. Like, all I wanted to do was to represent Sri Lanka and kind of share my culture.
She gathered artifacts during yearly trips to see her grandmother in Sri Lanka, packing them in a shipping container. For Julia, the effort to bring artifacts to her home and neighborhood was worth it.
In the beginning, I thought I should have the museum in Manhattan, where every other museum is at, right? But then I thought there's no better place to have a Sri Lankan museum but in the community itself.
Even as the community roots itself here, it's still recovering from the Sri Lankan Civil War, a conflict that was born out of ethnic tensions. Tamil speakers make up about 25% of Sri Lankans, while Sinhalese speakers make up the remaining three-quarters. Tamils felt discriminated against and called for an independent homeland.
Out of that grew a resentment of the minority against the majority, which erupted in the early 1980s into a full-scale civil war.
On one side were the Tamil Tigers, a rebel group. On the other, the Sri Lankan government. The war came to an end in 2009.
There's no sort of reliable estimates of how many civilians died. There's been no sort of closure for a number of civilians who saw their family members killed around them. A lot of these wounds are still open.
It was a very, very devastating time in Sri Lanka.
Some, like Julia, who's Sinhalese, and Vijay, who is Tamil, say the two groups coexist peacefully here on Staten Island.
There's such a huge unity down in New York, which is nice, because like there's no like grudges or anything like that. It's like, I feel like that's like back in Sri Lanka.
We have both type of customers come see us, Sinhalese and Tamils. No question, they are very friendly here. One malu roti and one malu pan, right? So the language we speak in Sinhalese.
But aside from doing business, they say the groups often stick to themselves, attending their own cultural and religious functions. Sinhalese are, for the most part, Buddhist. Tamils are largely Hindu or Christian. Separately, there's a small Muslim community.
Sometimes you really much don't see them all come in one place.
Bante Kandana heads Staten Island's Buddhist temple. From his perspective, some of the tensions from the Civil War do persist among Sri Lankans here.
Because of those problems what we had in the country, we kind of separated sometimes. Distrust, mistrust is still there. It would be a nice thing that we all can come together and doing. That could be really a blessing to the community here as well as the, back home.
While we were filming this story, a different tragedy struck in Sri Lanka.
I'm Shannon Ferry with the New York 1 Minute. The NYPD says it's monitoring the situation in Sri Lanka after multiple bombs tore through several churches and hotels.
There are at least 200 people who have been killed.
ISIS is now claiming responsibility.
7 suicide bombers carried out yesterday's deadly Easter Sunday attacks. According to published reports, they belong to a radical terrorist group called the National Tawheed Jama'at.
We all stand together at the time of despair so that we could get through this valley of darkness.
Staten Island Sri Lankan community gathered for a vigil shortly after the attacks.
I was surprised since it was like 10 years since the Civil War ended.
It was the deadliest attack Sri Lanka has experienced since the war ended.
There have been these pinprick attacks of violence, community on community, but nothing on this scale and nothing with this kind of reach.
Even though this is a different ideological conflict, the violence triggered painful memories and reignited fears.
10 years, clean straight, 10 years, no checking points, no militaries on the street. I go back and forth, no problem. Now this situation, a little scared, very scared.
There are fears the bombings could exacerbate ethnic tensions among Sri Lankans. As a minority group in Sri Lanka, Muslims have in the past been targets of violence. Since the bombings, there's been an uptick in attacks on Muslim-owned shops.
If this kind of massive attack were to set off further bouts of violence or tension, that would definitely complicate any attempt to suture the scars of the war and make sure that there is some kind of healing that happens.
Staten Island Sri Lankans continue to mourn in the weeks after the attacks.
Very sad, everybody very upset. I don't see my customer here, regular customers.
Some say that now more than ever, this is the time for the community's different groups to come together, both back in Sri Lanka and here on Staten Island.
Every time, I guess, our country's in a bad spot, we all feel it. It does not matter which part of the world we're in. We stay together and sort of like support each other.
We feel like we're a whole family, even though we do have our little differences.
It's important to stand together as a community, regardless of our ethno-religious identity.
Sri Lanka has a lion on the flag, right? So we use the lion to represent who we are. Just like lions, we have to be resilient and overcome something as big as this, and Sri Lankans need to come together and show people that are extremists and terrorists